Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. If you'd like to join us at any point, 1-800-351-1212. Thought we'd look back over the weekend of the March for Our Lives. Didn't have a chance to talk about that yesterday. We played the interview that we did with Ray and Sue Boland on the Mind Games Conference. And I thought it'd be good to at least look back for a little bit. Sometimes it's good to wait a day or two to kind of see what some other people have had to say about this. And, of course, this, as many people have said, may be the largest student protest in the history of America. That is debatable in light of how many actually showed up. You have statistics, for example, saying that more than 2 million students and their supporters were in Washington, D.C., and a number of other events around the country. May be true. The organizers for March for Our Lives estimated maybe 500,000 to 800,000. Best estimates are about 170,000 to 200,000, so it was not as well attended as even things like the March for Life, which almost never gets media attention. But because the media certainly wanted to focus on this, it was given a lot more prominence over the weekend. The rally in the District of Columbia, the D.C. rally, was funded by Oprah Winfrey and George Clooney and his wife and a number of other celebrities. And it was, of course, led by some of the students from Stoneman Douglas High School in Florida. And they, of course, vowed to make reducing gun violence kind of the central issue of their generation. And, of course, we have a number of other groups that gathered around that as well. And I'm going to, in just a few minutes, get to some of the articles we've posted on our website, pointofview.net. But that is certainly one of the issues that will be kind of front and center for our discussion today. And Gary Bauer, who's been on the program here, said that the anti-Second Amendment protest, as he called it, the March for Our Lives, took place, of course, over the weekend. They predicted, as I mentioned, about 500,000 to 800,000. He says that wasn't quite the case. The best estimates are maybe between 170,000 to 200,000. Of course, the District of Columbia no longer makes official estimates of crowd sizes. Probably a good idea. Remember, that was one of the sticking points with incoming President Donald Trump, and it's been a sticking point over the years with a number of other groups that have claimed a 1 million man march, a 1 million mother march, which never even came close to some of those numbers. But nevertheless, I like what Gary Bauer says here. If indeed they had 170,000, he says, I see 170,000 leftists each day on my life when I go to Washington, D.C., because the city voted 91% for Hillary Clinton. New York City's not a few hours away. So the point he was making is it may not be as impressive a crowd as you might think. And when you compare it to the annual March for Life, probably no greater, but nevertheless, we're going to be hearing about this for some time for a variety of reasons. First of all, this was an opportunity for these students to get in front of a microphone and say a lot of things, some of which probably don't need to be repeated. Again, Gary Bauer has this comment, this is why we don't let 13 and 14-year-olds vote, and maybe even why we have to think about even the others that decided to sign up to vote. He said many of the students were being exploited, he felt, by the left, and of course we'll see where that plays itself out. And there were very awful signs sometimes about everybody from Senator Marco Rubio to the NRA. We'll get into those in just a minute, because one of the articles I've posted is by Jarrett Stepman. I went to the March for Our Lives protest. Here are 7 takeaways. And if you go there, I would encourage you to not only look at it, but you even print it out. It will take you a couple of pages to do so. And if you have a color printer, what I think is so helpful is you get to see some of the signs and the posters. And, of course, as we well know, if the media personalities want to actually portray this in a positive light, they're going to just look at those individuals that are the most articulate, have the best posters. Of course, if there's another protest where they want to put them in a bad light, they'll find some of the wacko individuals out there and quote them and show some of their posters. So, and we know how that game is played. No surprise there. But it was, again, back to Gary Bauer for just a minute. He said, what was striking to me is there were no signs attacking the individuals responsible for the dereliction of duty that led to the Parkland shooting. Where were the demands for the Broward County Sheriff, Scott Israel, to resign after his department ignored dozens of signs? Why were there no calls for reform at the FBI after ignoring repeated warnings? Why were there no calls for the one common sense idea that has broad support, arming more guards at the schools? He says, by the way, lots of students do not agree with the agenda there, but most of the people in the so-called big media pretended they don't exist. And one of those individuals is a young man by the name of Kyle Kashuv, I think is how you pronounce his last name. Finally got a major interview on Face to the Nation. But again, as he points out, you can look at some of the links between that individual and David Hogg, who has been using certain words a little too often that are not helpful. And so, again, those are just a couple of initial thoughts about this. But one of the articles we have posted for you to read, in case you wanted to kind of get the full story, is a commentary done by Jarrett Stepman. We've quoted from him before. He's with the Heritage Foundation, or at least works with them, and actually published this in the Daily Signal. And he had 7 kind of takeaways. Let me give you the first one. We'll get the others after the break. And the first is one that we sort of already alluded to. Number one, it was a left-wing movement. He says it may seem painfully obvious, but it's worth noting that the march in Washington, D.C. was clearly a left-wing protest. As Julie Gunlock at the Federalist noted, some parents were led to believe that the March 14th National School Walkout would be about memorializing the victims of the Parkland shooting. It wasn't. The real mission, she said, was a walkout to demand Congress to pass more restrictive gun laws. He says the goal was even more obvious at the March for Our Lives march. Gun control is certainly associated with the modern left, but it's clearly from observing the protesters they were involved in other left-wing movements. And you can see all sorts of things here that I won't necessarily read, but if you look at some of the posters, you can see that, for example, we still have those pink hats that look like certain things that you've heard about before. There were numerous, anti-Trump signs, impeach the clown. I won't even go into all of those. And so, again, the crowd was certainly not a representative slice of what the country as a whole thinks about in terms of gun control, nor did it represent, he said, the opinions of most young Americans. He says, as Daily Signal recently polled and reported, polls show that millennials are no more in favor of gun control than their parents or grandparents. You would not believe that if you had watched some of the various stories, some of the interviews, that indeed, when asked specific questions broken out by age, gender, and a variety of other things, there is not this overwhelming groundswell for example, the millennial generation or others to have more restrictive laws. But you wouldn't exactly get that by seeing signs that say that the only thing easier to buy a gun in the United States is a Republican senator, one of the many signs that we let you see and to see a little bit more about. So we'll come back and talk about some of the other takeaways from Jarrett Stepman. Then we'll talk about this ongoing debate that's taking place. And then also it's worth looking back not only to Saturday, but to Friday, the decision by the president to sign the Omnibus spending bill, what we call the Omnibus Fiasco. And we'll talk about that as well before the hour is over. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Should the United States have a military parade on Veterans Day? The reaction to the suggestion by the president has brought up lots of comments. When I asked the question on my radio program, the phones lit up. Rachel Alexander wrote an article about the response from liberals concerning the idea, so I had her on the program. She explained that many liberal groups and news organizations argued that a military parade is what despots and authoritarian governments do. She reminded us that the president got the idea by watching the French military parade on Bastille Day, and she provided a short list of other non-authoritarian countries like Finland, Portugal, and Australia that also have parades for the military. When the president first floated the idea, the news outlets were obsessed with two issues. First, they warned that tanks driven down the streets in Washington, D.C. would damage the streets. But the administration announced that the parade would not include tanks. The second criticism was over cost. The parade would cost $3 million or much higher depending on how elaborate the parade might be. Callers responded that no one seemed to care about the cost of many of the other marches, protests, and parades held in Washington, D.C. that require everything from law enforcement to cleanup. I suggested that with the current budget of $1.3 trillion, a few million dollars is hardly even a rounding error. The general consensus was that if the parade was used to honor veterans, this would be a positive experience, especially for Vietnam veterans. But not everyone agrees. A number of Democrats in Congress have sponsored the Parade Act to prevent tax dollars from being used for a military parade. I suspect we'll be debating this issue all the way to Veterans Day. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Affirm Films, Paul, Apostle of Christ, starring Jim Caviezel, rated PG-13, now playing. Information at paulmovie.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. For a few more minutes, just want to talk about a couple of the observations from Jarrett Stepman, which we've posted on our website if you'd like to read it in its entirety, which also includes lots of pictures of posters and of various protesters, so you get a sense of what was happening at the March for Our Lives protest. He had 7 takeaways. The first one we mentioned, a left-wing movement. I don't think that's up for any debate. The second one, and let's give credit where credit was due, well-organized and also well-funded. I think the well-funded relates to the well-organized. If you think that this is put together by a bunch of high school students, guess again. This was very well-organized. Matter of fact, Jarrett Stepman said one of the larger and more or highly organized particular rallies he's seen in Washington, D.C., and that should tell you quite a bit because clearly staff from, he says, a number of activist pro-gun control organizations showed up, as would be expected. And he said it seemed like almost on every street corner there were people willing to register those to vote. So there are going to be a number of young people that attended these events, not only in Washington, D.C., but at the other venues around the country that may vote in this next election. We'll see where that plays out there. People carried signs from a lot of those groups that obviously were already made ahead of time and printed by those groups, the Brady Campaign to Prevent Gun Violence, Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America, some of those kinds of groups, and he's got some pictures of those that you can see as well. But he also said undoubtedly many people from around the country came to protest out of a sincere belief that they were making a positive difference to end violence. But there's also no doubt that a huge amount of professional organization and money went into the march. Of course, you have those who funded it. I mentioned Oprah Winfrey, George Clooney, let me mention others. Steven Spielberg and others provided that. And then, as BuzzFeed's reports, a litany of leftist organizations got involved. MoveOn.org, which, of course, is funded by George Soros, the Women's March, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Planned Parenthood was involved as well. And he said there's certainly many children present, but there's no way they could have put all this on their own. Outside help and organization was apparent. Well organized, fairly well attended, and again, provided a lot of funds from some of the left-wing organizations and some of these celebrities as well. Number 3, prayer is out. I guess that's certainly one that you would not be surprised by. The March for Our Lives protesters were seemingly not fans of prayer. Enough thoughts, prayers crossed out, action. You can look at many of the protest signs that we've posted there as well to look at that. Many protesters specifically condemned the act of offering prayers in the wake of shootings, pitting it against political action. Political action is often important, but it was strange to see so many signs specifically aimed at condemning prayer, and that was certainly the case. Jared Stepman goes on to say, in the wake of Parkland shooting, liberal calls to action have centered on banning guns, but such calls have neglected other serious issues related to school shootings that have nothing to do with firearms, including the way America, I should say, deals with the mentally ill. Another issue is how federal and local officials have let dangerous people like the Parkland shooter slip through the cracks. Often the problem is not a lack of laws, but a failure to implement many of them as well. He also says there are a number of serious proposals that would tackle the issue of school safety without confiscating guns. And, of course, he gives a list, and we'll talk about those a little bit later this hour if we have some time. But number 4, he said those who disagree are viewed as complicit in murder. You can see this in the signs. Dear government, ban assault rifles or be held liable for every life taken by one. Or stop making laws to control my body, make laws to control your guns. Just a couple of the posters there, which all, again, said that if you don't do what we say you will do, we will condemn you, and we will say that you are complicit in every one of the killings or the murders or the shootings that take place. And, of course, you can, as imagine, see many that condemn the National Rifle Association. Here's the one poster here. The NRA is the USA's ISIS. So NRA is compared to ISIS. NRA, of course, compared to a domestic terrorist organization. The list goes on and on. But let me get the last couple here. Number 5, Second Amendment seen as problematic and outdated. While gun control advocates have generally been cautious about outright attacking the Second Amendment, many of the protesters had no such reservations. There were a number of signs, again, we have some pictures of those, which have the picture of President Barack Obama, former President Barack Obama, and the sign says, I wish Obama had taken your guns. And there were many of those posters up there as well. So the lament that indeed President Barack Obama didn't confiscate guns was a failure on his part, or some that attacked the Supreme Court. I could not possibly conclude the framers made such a choice in the D.C. Heller case, which is the case that came out of the District of Columbia. And then, of course, you had some others that would have posters that said 21st century weapons, 18th century laws. But again, if you follow that logic, we didn't have anything related to the First Amendment that was other than newspapers. So how would that apply to radio, to television, to the Internet? Of course, again, conveniently used to attack the Second Amendment, ignored when you talk about the First Amendment. And then a couple others. Number 6, fuzzy facts. And we'll get more into that in just a minute in the next segment. Jarrett Stepman says, again, it was clear that while many of the protesters were articulate in defending their views, they were misinformed about some of the facts surrounding the gun debate. And he goes into some of the details, which I'll do in just a minute. But he was saying that it was a shocking number repeated by the various individuals was the bogus stat cooked up by the pro-gun group having to do with some of the previous issues that were surfaced. And where is that statistic there? Oh, the idea that there were 18 school shootings this year prior to Parkland. I've dealt with that in one of my commentaries, and so that one just keeps getting repeated again and again, even though the Washington Post called the statistic a flat-out lie. Also, all sorts of other misinformation, including one sign that called for a ban on automatic weapons, which have been banned since 1934. And in one of the commentaries I have coming out next week, I talk about some that actually say it is easy to step off the street, go into a gun store, and buy a machine gun. No, it's not. But nevertheless, those are some of the media myths that have been promoted. And then finally, number 7, not a gun-free zone, Jarrett Stepman talks about. He said the March for Our Lives crowd may have wanted to disarm Americans, but the event hardly took place in a gun-free zone. Armed police covered the streets to ensure the safety of those gathering in the nation's capital. In fact, there were even armored military vehicles embedded with groups of protesters, and we have some pictures of that as well. And some of the signs called for only the government to have firearms. Want to play with military weapons? One of the posters says, join the Army. Of course, the idea that only the government and the military should have access to firearms would not have sat well with the founders. Of course, that's why we talked about a standing army and a militia and a number of other things as well. So nevertheless, he gives you kind of 7 takeaways on these issues. And so there was a lot of misinformation about guns. So when we come back from the break, I want to just cover a few of those, which we've talked about occasionally here on the program before. Some of those, of course, we talk about in our third hour, which doesn't air here in Dallas. So I thought it would be worth a little bit of time to cover those again. And also to get into what is now being used as the most effective response to those of us that bring out some of the facts and figures. And it's called gunsplaining. And that's a phrase that was used by Adam Weinstein in a oft-repeated op-ed that appeared in the Washington Post, in which he, and now many gun control advocates say, you know, you gun rights people, you try to bully us because you talk about technical jargon. And I'll be the first to admit sometimes people that like guns tend to get into the technical jargon. But when you honestly think that we have to ban machine guns, and we've done that since 1934, when you see posters that say that it's easier to buy a gun than to buy Sudafed, that it's easier to buy a gun than it is to get birth control pills, that it's easier to buy a gun than it is to buy fireworks, okay, I think we need to get at least some of the accurate facts on the table when we have these kinds of discussions. So if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll get into a few of those facts and figures that need to be part of the public debate. And then we'll also spend some time looking back over the decision by Congress and then the president to sign the Omnibus spending bill, $1.3 trillion, something that is just so unprecedented. And yet, as the commentary I'm going to read in just a minute makes the case, in some respects, it put the president in sort of a no-win situation. So we'll talk about that. And, of course, if you'd like to join us, feel free to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. You can leave a comment on our Facebook page because we also broadcast live on Facebook. And don't forget, if you'd like to read some of the things that I'm reading from today, they're available at our website, pointofview.net. We'll be back right after this.
From PureFlix comes God's Not Dead, a light in darkness. Even in life's darkest valleys, a small flame can light the way toward healing and hope.
We are called to be a light in the darkness.
Starring David A.R. White and John Corbett.
God's Not Dead.
God's Not Dead, a light in darkness. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested. In theaters March 30th. More information is available at godsnotdead.com.
Christians are called to have answers. Answers for those who doubt our faith and answers for those going through difficult times. Thanks to our Truth Team members, Point of View provides those answers. You can play a vital role in bringing truth to the pressing issues of our day and truth when life doesn't seem fair. Help shine a light in darkness by giving today. Call 800-347-5151 or visit pointofview.net/team. Do not miss or minimize how much of a difference you can make. Take just a couple of minutes and join the Truth Team. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to leave a comment on our Facebook Live broadcast, that is certainly appropriate as well. Or if you'd like to just sit back and listen to some of the commentary, you are welcome to do so. Let me just again mention that as you hear us talk about these issues, right now I'm the only one talking, but next hour we're going to have the lead attorney, matter of fact, the single attorney that represented the Pregnancy Resource Centers in the Supreme Court decision last Tuesday. Michael Ferris will be with us, or in this next hour we'll even have a discussion with Johnny Erickson Tada about physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. But as you hear our conversations and you find yourself saying, okay, I'd like to read that again, or I'd like to see that statistic, or if I'm going to make this case to my friend, or I'm going to write a letter to the editor or post something on my Facebook page, I probably want to get some of the facts and figures. Don't forget, we post this material at our website, pointofview.net. Let me, for just a minute, though, say that one of the concerns that has surfaced, not only in this march, which, of course, has been certainly front and center, the March for Our Lives, but even in a lot of the coverage and even some of the discussion around various tables at these talking head shows, is that there are a number of inaccurate statistics or in some cases faulty conclusions. If we're going to craft effective public policies concerning gun violence, at the least we should insist on accurate facts and figures, which would be available to not only the legislators, but to us as citizens. So let me just give you 4 real quickly, and there are many more. But number 1, I think we have to at least acknowledge that violent crime has been dropping for decades. You hear all this media attention right now, and even though we certainly have seen just a little bit of an uptick in the last year, if you compare, say, decades to decades, you see something dramatically different. For example, the homicide rate in 2011 was almost half of the rate in 1991. The gun-related death rate, which is perhaps the most important statistic, in 2013 was half of what it was in 1993. So the bottom line is 20 years makes a real difference, and the violent crime rate has been going down. Now, that being said, you also hear and read about how dangerous certain places in America are, and that is true. That's because murders and even shootings are oftentimes located in just a few areas. As we said on this program a couple of weeks ago, but it's worth repeating, over half of the murders in America occur in just 2% of the nation's 3,000 counties. So there are some very dangerous areas indeed in this country. And more importantly, even those dangerous areas, most of those murders, a very high percentage of those murders, are linked either to gang activity or drug activity. So first, violent crime has been dropping, and you wouldn't necessarily know that by watching the media. Number 2, a high percentage of the gun deaths in America are due to suicides. Don't take my word for it. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, each year they publish data on all sorts of diseases, but they also publish data on gun deaths. And every year they have published that gun suicides outnumber gun homicides, in most cases by almost 2 to 1. In other words, 2/3 suicides, 1/3 gun homicides. Again, a statistic that doesn't surface very often. Now, you might say, well, that's why we need to take guns away from individuals. Do you really seriously think that if you took guns away from individuals, they wouldn't find another way to commit suicide? I have had a number of friends over these years that have committed suicide. Only one committed suicide with a gun. All the rest committed suicide in other different ways. And I won't go into the gruesome ways in which sometimes they did that. So, again, when we hear these numbers, you've got to, in a sense, divide by 3 to really get to the real number, and then recognize that then even those gun deaths happen in a small number of counties in America. The third is that most of the murders and shootings are done with handguns, not with rifles. Again, don't take my word for it. The FBI Uniform Crime Report actually shows that most gun-related homicides are done with handguns. In fact, rifles only account for less than 3% of gun-related homicides. So again, the attempt to ban rifles, AR-15s, AK-47s, whatever it might be, isn't going to even affect in an appreciable way the homicides, as we've talked about before. And the fourth and final one, often we can predict what kind of person or what sort of person will commit a murder or a mass shooting. When we talk about murders, again, the percentages are very high. A significant percentage of the men who commit murder either are in a gang, or they're on drugs, or they're an abuser in a troubled relationship. Then a high percentage of the mass shooters, as we've talked about before, have extensive histories of mental illness. And so, those are just a couple of those facts that would be helpful in a discussion that seem to sometimes be missing in the midst of some of the cliches and some of the slogans and some of the posters. And this, as I said just a few minutes ago, was one of the reasons that you are starting to hear more and more people talk about gunsplaining, because as soon as you start bringing some of these facts to the table, the response has been, well, you're just gunsplaining. And gunsplaining is this idea that, well, you're just trying to confuse the debate with all sorts of technical jargon. And again, oftentimes the gun debate is portrayed as a moral debate, not really a technical debate. And it's both. And so I will acknowledge that certainly we need to look at the moral issues there. But again, what you're seeing right now is the idea of saying, well, these gun control or gun rights activists are trying to bully gun control activists with technical jargon. And I'll be the first to admit sometimes it happens. If you've ever been to a gun store, a gun range, you meet two kinds of people. You meet those that are just very nice and very helpful. Obviously, they're the ones behind the counter, because if they want to sell you a gun, they're not going to make fun of you, and they're not going, and even at a gun range, they're going to be ones that are going to give you some instruction. Then you got some of these people who have just a real big ego, and they just want to tell you, all the things they know and why you're so stupid, and we've always been there. But that's true about everything. If you've ever tried a new hobby, you have some people that want to help you out. If you want to learn golf or, anything it might be, or you want to learn crochet, or you want to learn a little bit more about how to paint your house, you're going to meet some people that are going to be very helpful, and you're going to meet some people that are going to just use technical terms to try to intimidate you into silence. And if you've ever been on a college campus, you know that some university professors just love the jargon because they want you to be so impressed about how intelligent they are. But, again, can we at least acknowledge that, okay, maybe some of that is true, but it isn't true that, as I mentioned before, that it's easier to buy an AR-15 than to buy Sudafed, or it's easier to buy an AR-15 than it is to get birth control pills, or whatever it might be, or the only thing easier to buy than a gun is a Republican senator, all the lines that we've been hearing here, or that you can step off the streets, buy an automatic machine gun, on and on, some of these facts and figures that simply aren't there. So my suggestion is that if we really want to have an honest debate about, quote, common sense gun control, let's at least put some of those arguments and facts and figures on the table, and let's not allow individuals to say, well, you're just gunsplaining. Because one of the things I love about a piece that David French pointed out is, imagine if just a while back some of the pro-life individuals began to argue that you could not use certain kinds of surgical procedures because that, after all, those should be heavily regulated so that you could not kill unborn children. Would we then sit still for what would be called device-splaining? And I thought that was great to turn it back to kind of the pro-life discussion. And, of course, that is an illustration, once again, of some of the need that we have in this debate. So, again, as we've said before, everybody has a right to their opinion, but they don't have a right to their own facts. And we do have some facts and figures that have been put out by very reputable organizations like the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, like the FBI Uniform Crime Report. We have Pew Research studies. We've had various Washington Post attempts to validate or falsify some of the facts and figures and statistics. And some of those have been very helpful as well in the debate. So, again, if you find yourself saying, I would like to see those statistics for myself, and then if I see they are valid, then I would like to post them on my Facebook page, or make a Twitter post, or maybe write a letter to the editor, or send an email to my legislator and say, what about some of these facts? We certainly make that available to you at our website, pointofview.net. Let's, if we can, take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about the omnibus spending bill. Donald Trump didn't have real good options. He should have seen it coming, though, so we're not going to let him or Congress off the hook. We'll talk about that right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Members of the Klickitat and Cascade tribes in Oregon have lost burial grounds and seen sacred artifacts bulldozed for a highway project. For centuries, these Native Americans practiced their religion peacefully near Mount Hood. There they buried their dead and performed a variety of religious rituals, many of which are tied closely to the earth itself. When Highway 26 was set to be widened, the tribes alerted the Federal Highway Administration to the sacred site, including the presence of a stone altar, ancient burial grounds, and trees and medicinal plants, all of which are used for the observance of their religion. But their pleas fell on deaf ears. The tribes filed a lawsuit asserting that the Highway Administration interfered with the free exercise of their religion in violation of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. In early 2018, a federal magistrate judge recommended that the lawsuit be dismissed. The magistrate noted that though the sacred site was destroyed, there was no evidence that the tribes were coerced to act contrary to their religious beliefs. Undoubtedly, these tribes will appeal the decision, and they should. These Native Americans view this land as their church. None of us would stand for the bulldozing of our houses of worship to make way for a highway. Why should Native Americans be denied the same consideration? To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. I hope you enjoyed this episode of First Liberty Briefing. You can learn more amazing stories about how everyday Americans are standing up and saving religious freedom. Just visit firstliberty.org. You'll be inspired, educated, and informed. Visit firstliberty.org right now.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you were listening to this last Friday, you know that we were talking about the possibility that the president might have actually decided to veto the omnibus spending bill, $1.3 trillion, which actually only gets us to the end of September. And again, to put that in perspective, as I shared with Penna Dexter in the first hour when we were talking about that, I think when Ronald Reagan left office, the accumulated national debt from George Washington to Ronald Reagan was $1.3 trillion, which, frankly, was probably a pretty good investment when you think about the wars we fought, the Pacific Railroad and all the things and the interstate highway system and putting a man on the moon and all the others. But again, spend $1.3 trillion in part of a year, since already some of it had been spent. It would have been good for the president to have vetoed it, but he did not. And the second article we've posted here is by Kurt Slichter. He's a character, to put it mildly. We've had him on before, and we actually edited out a word or two here, he says. But nevertheless, he says, if you remember the Kobayashi Maru scene in Star Trek II, what that's all about is that this was, of course, where those individuals, part of the Federation, were put into a simulation where there was a no-win possibility. And so here you have the same kind of situation. And he said Donald Trump just had that happen to him with the Omnibus abomination, though don't be fooled by the passive voice. He desires some blame for letting this come to this. This absolutely essential military spending was wrapped in a fat suit of glistening, rancid pork, and the congressional rats had already abandoned ship and fled out of town when it was dumped on his desk. So he had a stark choice. Trump could sign it and enrage his base, but ensure our military could prepare for the wars looming on the horizon, or he could veto it and launch a government shutdown with about 0% chance of succeeding in getting a significantly better deal. Trump chose the least worst of two bad options, and I, for one, refuse to lose my, he says, sleep over it. There was a last-minute congressional jam-down of a swamp-generated monstrosity, and Trump deserves a slice of the blame for not seeing it coming. He evidently failed to ensure that his priorities and preferences were included as this sausage was being made, and suddenly the whole thing was dropped on him and us seemingly out of nowhere and became a thing overnight. Except it wasn't overnight. The train had been coming down the tracks for 3 months. The congressional weasels succeeded in sneaking it in right before they ditched town. Trump is liable for letting himself be put in that position, but the Republican leadership is responsible for putting him there. Now the people who hate Trump anyway, many of whom would have squealed with delight at a President Jeb or someone else sign the bill, were delighted for a chance to scream betrayal. But his choice, but many of them, this is just another chance to tear apart the Republican coalition that rejected him. Many still dream of someday getting a slot in the Ben Sasse administration, but none of them offered a game plan for an alternative. Because what was the alternative? Step 1, veto the bill. Step 2, ? Step 3, Congress passes conservative spending bill we all love. If anyone can explain step 2 to me, I would sure appreciate it. After all, that's the kind of key step, and no one seems to have a good answer for what that might have consisted of. The simple fact is that while the Republican has the majority of individuals, conservatives do not. Step 2 can't be wishing or waiting or waving a magic wand. If you think a government shutdown caused by Trump's veto would result in a better outcome, well, that requires some explanation. I'd be interested to see a citation to a government shutdown where the shutter downer won. There isn't one. People like us love government shutdowns because we think government sucks, but the rest of America doesn't, as he says. It just doesn't. I don't want that to be the truth. I don't like it, but that's how it is. We're not yet the unassailable majority, and the United States is not a dictatorship either. This is an overcompromise and a bad deal. The bill is not what Trump promised and not what we voted for. The base is bad, furious, and it has a right to be. But again, he goes on to talk about some of the other elements as well in that particular situation, and I'll pick it up a little bit later where he says, don't do what the enemies want you to say. He says this is a bump in the road, a road that includes Justice Gorsuch, defeating ISIS, Keystone, regulatory rollback, tax cuts, and many other conservative achievements. Our enemies would love for us to throw all that away because we got a case of the mads, but that would be stupid. There's another spending fight coming. Trump says he won't sign another one of these pieces of garbage. After the reaction he got the other day, it's likely he'll keep his word. He should demand that he receive the next bill in final form 30 days before the deadline. No more 30 minutes to read 2,200 pages nonsense. This will give real conservative leaders a chance to disinfect it with sunlight, like Senator Rand Paul did, highlighting some of that in the last one. Finally, Mitch McConnell needs to earn the base's lost confidence by getting the Republicans to toss out the filibuster rule and start passing our priorities, because if these hacks blow the Senate majority, and they absolutely could, Chuck Schumer will do that the first day anyway. Oh, and it would be really good for morality to get a couple of these nominees that are hung up right now confirmed. And if Mitch McConnell has to change the rules to outflank the Democratic obstruction, okay. What do the rest of us do? Not quit. Get up, brush off, get ready to fight. Tighten and jump back in the game. If you can't take a hit, you can't stand to encounter an obstacle. If you're giving up everything because something went wrong, you're not really committed to recovering your country and your own freedom. This is going to be hard. This is going to take time, a lot of it. Rome wasn't built in a day, and draining the swamp will not be done in a day either. We're going to have more days like Omnibus Friday in the future, lots of them. That's how it goes. But also remember that if we have days like November 8th, 2016, we might actually make it all worthwhile. So again, I summarized a longer piece, but it gives you a little bit of a sense of, even if you were upset by what was passed by Congress last week and signed by the president on Friday, there are possible opportunities in the future to turn that around. And I do believe that it is time for the president, in some kind of address somewhere, to say the same thing that Ronald Reagan did when these omnibus bills showed up at his desk. He did this at a State of the Union address. It's too late for Donald Trump to do it at this State of the Union address, because that won't happen until next year. But have another address where I remember Ronald Reagan taking a stack of papers, and they were almost a foot high. And he said, "This is the omnibus spending bill that you gave to me. And if you do not pass an actual budget," he drops it on the desk, "I will veto it." And again, I think it is clear that the president needs to say, we need to have this on the desk of all members of Congress 30 days before. We all need to be able to look at it long before that. No dropping it in our laps 30 minutes to read 2,200 pages. That's not the way we're supposed to run the government. And as I've said before, if any one of us did not have a budget for organizations we run, the board would say, okay, where's the budget? And when are you going to get to the budget? And there are supposed to be 12 different budgets that go first to the House, then to the Senate, then a conference committee, which then eventually can be signed or vetoed by the president. And this is the way we were taught in school that government is supposed to run. It's about time to get government to run in that way once again. Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to be talking with Michael Ferris. He is the president and CEO and general counsel of the Alliance Defending Freedom. But most importantly, he was the attorney to represent the pregnancy resource centers in front of the Supreme Court last Tuesday. He's going to be with us for an hour to talk about the importance of that case and some of these other very important cases. So if you'd like to join us, Michael Ferris with us, and we'll be talking with him and then with you right after this.
From Affirm Films, the studio that brought you Risen and War Room, comes Paul, Apostle of Christ. Two men challenged an empire in order to live out the gospel of Jesus Christ and spread their message to the world.
Where sin abounds, grace abounds more.
Starring Jim Caviezel. Paul, Apostle of Christ. Rated PG-13. May be inappropriate for children under 13. Now playing. More information is available at paulmovie.com.
Few of us get the chance to really make a difference, but today you have an opportunity. The question is whether you will seize it. Becoming a Truth Team partner with Point of View magnifies your impact in this generation and perhaps for many to come. When you stop what you're doing and call us or give online, you invest in hard work that has changed lives and communities for 45 years. Grab this opportunity. Call 800-347-5151 or visit pointofview.net/team. Don't let this opportunity pass by. Join the team and make a difference. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.